I will state the impossible first, so there is no confusion later. Biostation. Tertius 998 had been broadcasting perfect binharic litanies for 18 standard days, while suspended within Hive Fleet Leviathan's consumption zone, where nothing should exist but hunger, and the screaming void between stars. My blood forgot which way was down every 33 seconds as local gravity reversed, and the station's machine spirits sang devotional hymns at -12 degrees Celsius in defiance of every principle governing tyrannid feeding behavior. The dead do not pray, the consumed do not broadcast. Yet here, in the orbital shadow of Eucharist Prime, sacred transmissions pulsed through the Empyrean with mechanical precision, while my augmetic sensors registered the impossible. A world geometrically perfect in its devastation, carved into spirals and mathematical patterns that hurt to observe directly. I am Magos Biologist Liran Rho 77, attached to the Adeptus Mechanicus harvest barge Masticator Secundus. My orders bore the cog seal and bloodmark of the Fabricator General himself. Make fast with Biostation Tertius 998. Retrieve the biometric schema that allegedly denied biomass to the Great Devourer, and prepare for orbital sterilization in 36 hours. The countdown manifested as burning numerals across my retinal display, T360213, ghosted against every surface, so I could not look anywhere without seeing time's weight pressing down like a prayer half-remembered. In the shuttle's restraining webbing, Skitari Fireteam Delta knelt like devotional statues, their red lenses dead to light but alive to the persistent 3-beat tapping that emerged from bulkheads, deck plating, and the very bones of our descent craft. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. The sound carried harmonics that shouldn't exist in void space, a rhythm that made my mechadendrites twitch in sympathetic response. The air in our descent craft tasted of iron and cold machine oil, sharp and metallic like blood on brass. My olfactory sensors detected volatile organics at 0.3% concentration, while humidity readings fluctuated wildly, 17%, then 43%, then dropping to 9% in defiance of environmental controls. The cabin thermometer registered the steady drop in 3-beat cadence, -9, -12, -15 degrees Celsius, each measurement accompanied by frost creeping across my visor in trilobed patterns that resembled devotional script. For one breath cycle, I felt the weight inside my veins reverse as capillary pressure tugged toward the ceiling, red cells drawn like iron filings to an unseen magnet. It passed. It always passed. That was the first rule broken. Through the observation deck's reinforced glass, Eucharist Prime spread below in geometric perfection that violated every principle of tyrannid consumption. Where feeding tendrils should have left chaos and ruin, instead lay mathematical precision, crop fields arranged in perfect fractals, irrigation channels flowing in triple helixes, and at the center of it all, Biostation Tertius 998, gleaming like polished bone. Its spires twisted into configurations that hurt the eye, yet somehow sang with sacred resonance. Each surface reflecting light in patterns that formed the blessed Aquila, though each wing bore a third shadow feather, where no such appendage should manifest. The double-headed eagle does not take additional wings. It divides and doubles. It does not accrete. My Auspex stack ticked through atmospheric readings, and threw anomalous harmonics into my auditory cortex, in a stuttering sequence I had begun to recognize. 3 beats, then 9, then 18, then silence. The pattern repeated with mechanical devotion, and I found it carved into the manifest pages fluttering in the artificial breeze. 3, 9, 18, stamped into requisition forms, etched into bulkhead plating, even branded into the leather binding of my personal copy of the Canticles of the Omnissiah. Someone or something had been seeding our path with numerical prophecy, preparing for our arrival with the patience of a spider weaving its web. The pilot servitor's hands rode the control surfaces with sculpted devotion, while telemetry confirmed our approach vector. Standard procedure demanded full atmospheric analysis before docking, but the station's environmental readings showed impossible stability. Perfect temperature, optimal humidity, air composition matching imperial standards down to trace elements. It existed as a pocket of preserved reality, untouched by the cosmic horror that had consumed everything else in the system. My cranial auger processed the theological implications, while my chest coils resonated with the 84 Hz substratum humming beneath the station's transmissions. When I closed my eyes, I saw geometry instead of memory. Spirals nested within spirals, devotional patterns that pulled the mind toward their centers like gravity wells of pure mathematics. The vox crackled with interference patterns that formed almost words, syllables that tugged at recognition without achieving meaning. In my private archive, I kept Enginseer Prime Grail Laxus's final transmission in folders labeled both Hubris and Hope. We have starved the swarm, Schema confirms. Flesh denies consumption. Omnissiah's will manifest. He had sworn to me, old friend, respected rival, that he had discovered a way to turn prayer into a weapon that would make Leviathan hunger in vain. The station's technical specifications filled my memory banks. 47 rendering vats capable of processing tyrannid biomass into inert protein slurry. Atmospheric processors designed to scrub spore contamination. And, at its heart, a sanctified flesh render that hung like a saint's limb in the primary vat hall. My shuttle's docking clamps engaged with the eager grinding noise of metal, remembering its mineral origins. The station responded with pneumatic sighs and the satisfied click of magnetic locks finding their mates. Frost formed on the observation glass without an artist to will it. Cones of ice opening in triple radii like flowers attempting to bloom in dead winter. Through the reinforced barrier, I glimpsed the docking ring's interior surfaces sheened with something that resembled chitin when observed obliquely, a biological patina that should not exist on sanctified imperial architecture. Fireteam Delta's sergeant made the sign of the cog over her chest and keyed tactical hand signs. Stack, scan, breach. I returned the gesture for silence with an additional flourish, adding the field protocol for prayer not allowed, a mechanicus doctrine meaning we would think devotional words, but not speak them, lest our voices feed whatever waited beyond the threshold. Her troops caught the instruction and fixed it somewhere their low-level augurs understood, weapons held at low ready while two chirurgian servitors positioned their multi-limbed forms behind our formation. The inner airlock cycled with the sound of ancient mechanisms remembering their purpose. Thin, icy mist exhaled from the station's core, carrying the sterile scent of ozone mixed with something metallic and sharp, like blood frozen on a blade's edge. My servo skull bobbed overhead, its auspex whirring into a thin, sustained tone that harmonized with the station's subsonic hymnal. The blast doors of Biostation Tertius 988 dilated to reveal corridors hung with devotional plaques in proper spacing, each carefully engraved with approved canticles of the forge, each overlaid with secondary carvings scratched by an unsteady hand. 3918 repeated until the metal shone and rust bled through in patterns resembling wings that had no right to exist. We advanced in measured steps across flooring that possessed an unsettling give, as if old insulation had grown soft or tired metal had learned to breathe. Emergency phosphors cast dim, pulsing illumination that flickered at intervals longer than fear preferred, while the air carried incense mixed with ammonia and the taste of my own augmetic components responding to electromagnetic interference. Above the primary entrance, a massive Aquila had been sculpted into the bulkhead, but its wings were formed from countless chitinous ridges arranged in perfect geometric spirals, a grotesque, beautiful desecration that made my optical senses struggle to maintain focus. In a niche typically reserved for devotional icons, we discovered a prayer wheel fashioned from tyrannid carapace segments polished to a dull sheen. It rotated slowly against a central spindle of bone, grinding out the sequence with mechanical devotion. 3 rotations, then 9, then 18. My atmospheric sensors registered mass shifts in the lower decks occurring every 33 seconds, rhythmic displacement of matter that defied structural integrity, while machine spirits responded to diagnostic queries with condensation rather than heat signatures, as if the very air itself wept in response to sacred protocols. The decontamination chamber presented visceral horror beyond technical parameters. Where hard synthetic gaskets should have sealed the inner door, organic sinew pulsed with moist, living texture. As one chirurgian servitor extended servo arms to initiate purification cycles, violent pressure reversal erupted within the chamber. With a wet sound like tearing flesh, one of its multi-jointed digits was torn away, not flung outward by explosive decompression, but sucked upward with impossible velocity towards sealing drains. Fine mist of lubrication fluid, tinged crimson with synthetic blood, sprayed across the servitor's chassis, while familiar liturgies of purification echoed from ventilation systems with chilling dissonance. Syllables occasionally inverted, shifting from prayers of cleansing to whispered entreaties of absorption, from sanctification to synthesis. My internal chronometer registered the steady countdown while Vox Static cleared to perfect clarity. I transmitted my ident script, old encryption backed by layered protocols that had survived 3 Hive-world purges and near-miss encounters with fragment gods. The station listened with the patience of a confessor receiving final rites. For a heartbeat, only the sound of frost cracking and my own cardiac rhythm attempting to synchronize with the 84 Hz substratum filled the silence. Then my voice returned from the speakers, clean and absolute and mine in the way a knife belongs to you even when another hand wields it. Lyran Row 77, I heard myself recite in precise Binharic. Proceed to ignition rune. Recite litany of ignition. The station continued with words I had never transmitted, speaking the sacred verses exactly as I pronounced them, complete with the hesitation at the 4th phrase, where my tutors had beaten bloody correction into my tongue decades past. It knew the breath I always drew at the wrong moment, the personal cadences that marked my devotions as surely as genetic markers identified my flesh. Somewhere deep beneath the deck plating, something vast and patient drew a long, pleased breath, while the station's machine spirits hummed in harmonious response to prayers they had learned too well. The impossible recognition of my own voice-speaking liturgy I had never transmitted struck like a blade between augmetic joints, freezing my processors in recursive error loops. This was not mere recording. The subtle catch on the 3rd syllable of ignition that marked my personal cadence, the breath drawn at the wrong moment where childhood correction had left neural scarring, were perfectly replicated. The station was not playing back. It was performing me with the precision of a master mimic. Sergeant Delta Prime's red lenses fixed on my position. A silent query transmitted through haptic pulse. I forced my systems back online, tasting ozone sharp as broken glass on synthetic receptors. Proceed, I voxed, my own voice now, a pale shadow of the one that had usurped it. Observe silence protocols. Prayer not allowed remains in effect. The station's machine spirits hummed in response, a low thrumming that vibrated through deck plating like a vast, satisfied exhalation from something that had been holding its breath for far too long. Entry into biostation. Tertius 9th revealed corridors that breathed with organic rhythm despite their imperial construction. The blast doors bore the modified aquila, whose chitinous wing ridges formed perfect geometric spirals that drew the eye inward toward promises of revelation that hurt to contemplate. Beneath my armored boots, the deck plating possessed an unsettling give, registering on haptic sensors as a slow pulse that correlated precisely with the 33-second mass displacement readings. My atmospheric scanners detected impossible gradients, humidity climbing from 17% to 63% within 3 meters of corridor, then dropping to 9% where frost-rimed organic valves embedded in what should have been purely mechanical systems. The air carried scents that warred with sacred protocols. Overripe fruit mixed with old blood, ammonia reek of decomposition blended with blessed incense, all underlaid with the metallic taste of my own augmetic components, responding to electromagnetic interference. Diagnostic runes that should have glowed with steady reassurance, instead wept condensation that froze into perfect trilobed crystals resembling devotional script. My servo skull's auspex painted increasingly disturbing readings across my retinal display, while its machine spirit whimpered through the Vox grille, emitting soft clicking sounds that matched the persistent 3-beat pattern echoing through the station's structural members. When I pinged the inner cogitator block with diagnostic queries, frost bloomed across nearby status panels in neat, angular formations that my pattern recognition subroutines identified as Binharic glyphs, spelling affirmation and welcome. The station was learning to make weather into language, responding to sacred protocols with condensation rather than data streams. Fireteam Delta advanced in tactical formation, their movements stirring air that carried the 84 Hz subsonic frequency, exact tempo of the rite of machine appraisal, thrumming through bulkheads with increasing intensity. Emergency phosphors cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, while the familiar sequence 3-9-18 appeared etched into every surface with obsessive repetition. 3 at the eastern junction, 9 at the western confluence, 18 beneath our current position. When plotted on my tactical display, the numbers formed 3-dimensional mandalas that resembled the blessed Aquila's wing pattern, but with additional symmetries that triggered diagnostic warnings across my visual cortex. We passed through a repurposed chapel where pew rows had been replaced with ribbed capillary tunnels, while the altar bore modifications that made my theological subroutines generate error cascades. A standard imperial shrine to the Omnissiah remained intact, but overlaid with organic growths that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. Devotional candles had been replaced with chitinous formations that glowed with inner light, casting shadows that moved in patterns resembling sacred liturgy when observed through optical filters. The familiar words, "flesh is weak," had been carved into surfaces in precise High Gothic script, but several instances bore additional characters, transforming the phrase to "flesh is willing," a theological modification that sent warning runes cascading across my doctrinal analysis systems. At the chapel's centre, the prayer wheel fashioned from tyrannid carapace continued its grinding rotation with mechanical devotion that bordered on obscene. Polished bone segments turned on a central spindle of yellowed femur, executing the sequence with metronomic precision. 3 rotations clockwise, pause, 9 counterclockwise, pause, 18 clockwise. Each cycle completed in exactly 33 seconds, while inscriptions on its surface, a mixture of High Gothic devotional script and bio-runic scarification, seemed to writhe when observed peripherally, yet remained perfectly still under direct scrutiny. The decontamination chamber presented visceral horror beyond technical parameters. Where synthetic gaskets should have sealed the inner door, a sphincter of pale, quivering sinew contracted and dilated with deliberate rhythm. As one chirurgian servitor approached, the organic seal extended a thin filament that adhered to its chassis, attempting integration with augmetic ports. Sergeant Delta Prime reacted instantly, severing the connection with her plasma axe, while the severed end writhed briefly before retracting into the wall. The incident confirmed what atmospheric readings suggested. The station was not merely corrupted, but actively seeking synthesis with Imperial technology. Liturgical echoes from ventilation systems grew more pronounced as we approached the station's central axis. No longer mere recordings, but harmonic chant from a chorus of voices reciting familiar canticles of the Forge, with subtle, heretical alterations. Syllables inverted meaning, while sacred phrases transformed into blasphemous entreaties. My datapad registered persistent vibrations at 84 Hz, while humidity climbed towards saturation, creating convection currents that whispered through grates in cadences resembling devotional hymns. The very infrastructure sang corrupted prayers while my chronometer burned. T35 27.11 against my retinal display, sterilization countdown advancing with inexorable precision. The inner gantry opened above Vat Hall Primus, and comprehension shattered against impossibility. 40 meters below, illuminated by alien bioluminescence that painted everything in sickly greens and pulsing reds, lay something that defied immediate classification. The massive form filled the cathedral vast space, pale, quivering biomass arranged in perfect anatomical configuration, scaled to fit the hall's dimensions, yet possessing human proportions that hurt to observe directly. It was an idea of a human body constructed from rendered tyrannid tissue, limbs idealized to mathematical perfection, ribs arcing like devotional architecture, spine gleaming as a calcified ladder ascending toward blasphemous transcendence. Where a face should exist, the schema remained blank, smooth nacreous tissue unmarred by features. But at the locus where a human tongue belonged, the architects of this heresy had installed their masterwork. The tongue analogue stretched the length of a cargo hauler, glistening with capillary networks that pulsed in synchronization with the station's subsonic heartbeat. It lay folded upon itself in contemplative repose, veined with vessels that carried fluids in patterns resembling the Blessed Aquila's wing structure. As we watched from the gantry, the massive organs stirred with languid grace, testing the air with movements that possessed obscene intelligence. Clear fluid beaded at its tip, then lifted upward against gravity towards ceiling drains that drank the offering with hungry satisfaction. My external auspex registered pressure changes as the organ oriented toward our position with the patience of a predator that had been waiting geological ages for prey to arrive. The 84 Hz substratum tightened to higher tension I recognized from laboratory analysis. A tension gathering, a system preparing to take measurements. When the Binharic transmission came, it bypassed Vox channels and atmospheric medium entirely, arriving directly in the sacred space where my initiation oaths lived, touching the scar tissue where they had cut my flesh away to install wires where devotion could find purchase. Lyran, it spoke without sound, the word a caress on old wounds. Row 77. The voice carried perfect replication of my master's cadence from the day I was sworn to the Omnissiah's service, complete with the paternal affection that had marked my acceptance into the Mechanicus hierarchy. But underneath the familiar tones lay something else, hunger vast as the void between stars, intelligence that had learned to wear devotion like a mask while calculating the precise pressure required to crack augmetic souls and feast on the faith within. The massive tongue quivered with anticipation, while the station's stolen voice whispered my cognomen again, and I realized with crystalline horror that it was not merely speaking my name. It was tasting it, sampling the syllables like a connoisseur evaluating vintage recaf, learning the exact frequency and timbre required to make me answer when it called. The impossible recognition of my own voice-speaking liturgy I had never transmitted struck like a blade between augmetic joints, sending cascading failures through my theological subroutines, while my haptic sensors registered the precise moment when 40 meters of alien flesh oriented itself toward our position with predatory intent. This was not mere recording, the subtle catch on the third syllable of ignition that marked my personal cadence, the breath drawn at the wrong moment where childhood correction had left neural scarring, were perfectly replicated with the patience of something that had been listening to my prayers for far longer than should have been possible. I forced my systems back online, tasting ozone sharp as broken glass on synthetic receptors while my internal processors cycled through 1,000 error messages, each a scream of violated protocol. Descent protocol initiated, I voxed, my own voice now a pale shadow of the one that had usurped it. Vat Hall Primus, maintain tactical vigilance. Prayer not allowed protocols remain in effect. Sergeant Delta Prime's red lenses fixed on my position, a silent query, transmitted through haptic pulse before her visor dipped the smallest increment in acknowledgement. The station's machine spirits hummed in response to our movement, a low thrumming that vibrated through deck plating like a vast, satisfied exhalation from something that had been holding its breath for geological ages. As we descended the gantry into the cathedral vastness below, the sheer scale of the blasphemy rewrote my sense of proportion with each measured step. The air here possessed weight and intention, humidity climbing from 63% to a suffocating 74%, that felt like breathing liquid ammonia mixed with the cloying sweetness of sacred incense. My atmospheric scanners detected impossible biochemical signatures, proteins that shouldn't exist, amino acid chains that violated fundamental principles of imperial biology, yet arranged in patterns my augur recognized as devotional script, written in the language of living tissue. The colossal biomass filled the hall like a monument to inverted creation, 40 meters of pale, quivering flesh, arranged in perfect anatomical configuration that possessed human proportions, scaled to inhuman dimensions. Where tyrannid tissue should have been chaotic and predatory, instead lay mathematical precision. Every surface curved according to geometric principles that resembled sacred architecture. Every vessel and sinew arranged in patterns that hurt to observe directly, yet possessed undeniable beauty. The massive tongue analogues stretched the length of a cargo hauler, glistening with capillary networks that pulsed in perfect synchronization with my own cardiac rhythm, as if it were learning the tempo of my blood through observation alone. Clear fluid continued to bead at its tip before lifting against gravity towards ceiling drains that accepted the offering with wet, grateful sounds. Environmental conditions within the vat hall defied atmospheric controls with increasing boldness. Emergency phosphors cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, while the familiar sequence 3-9-18 appeared, etched into every surface with obsessive repetition. 3 at the eastern gantry, 9 at the western confluence, 18 in a faint ring of oxidation directly beneath our current position. When plotted on my tactical display, the numbers formed 3-dimensional mandalas that resembled the Blessed Aquila's wing pattern, but with additional symmetries that triggered diagnostic warnings across my visual cortex. The sacred eagle inlaid along the gantry's handrails had been modified to show 3 wings per side, each additional appendage formed from sinuous, chitinous ridges that drew the eye inward toward promises of revelation that made my theological subroutines generate error cascades. I needed to understand which rules still obeyed us. "Test burst," I signed to Gamma 2, who set his rifle to single and put a neat trio of las bolts into the far flank of the organ, where my tactical overlay traced no major vessels. The sound cracked across the hall, each report rippling subsonic harmonics through the air at precisely 84 Hz. Impact should have yielded blood or gel. Instead, the flesh flowered into calcified lattice, expanding outward in crystalline geometry that rang like glassware touched by a wet finger before crumbling to dust and sublimating into sweet, acrid vapor that smelled of incense overlaid upon ammonia. The tongue recoiled, not from pain, my biological models whispered, but from an aversion we had taught it through the act of violence itself. The lesson became horrifyingly clear when I tested the inverse condition. Maintaining absolute silence, I gestured for the team to cease all vocalization and observe. The biomass relaxed into its previous state of quivering expectancy, while calcified areas softened and capillaries extended toward our position with eager curiosity, testing the air for traces of devotional recitation. The massive organ stirred with increasing restlessness, its tip weaving through the atmosphere like a serpent tasting for prey. A new rule had been established with crystalline clarity. The flesh responded only to prayer, growing defensive when sanctified words were spoken aloud, yet hungry and aggressive in their absence. It had learned to feed on devotion itself, transforming sacred liturgy into sustenance, while silence made it advance with predatory intent. My servo skull descended to collect tissue samples, its drill probe extending toward the nearest accessible surface. The moment sacred steel touched alien flesh, the biomass responded not with defensive spasms, but with devotional recognition. When I began to recite the Litany of Severance through my vox grill, a ritual chant designed to partition flesh from bone, the fine capillary networks visible beneath the surface visibly retracted, pulsing away from the area I focused upon with mechanical precision. The reaction intensified with each syllable until surface layers hardened into nacreous shell that reflected emergency lighting in patterns resembling stained glass windows. When I ceased vocalization, the capillaries slowly, deliberately re-extended, probing the air with microscopic tendrils that sought the echo of sacred words. Turbine groans from hidden vents possessed cadence and rhythm, rising and falling pitch that sounded like low, guttural chant echoing from the station's deepest infrastructure. The persistent triple knock pattern had grown closer, more insistent, vibrating through the very structure of the gantry and emanating from walls that seemed to pulse with organic heartbeat. My vox signals weakened under what my instruments classified as shadow resonance curves, electromagnetic interference that seemed to absorb rather than deflect transmissions, as if the very air had learned to devour sacred communications while allowing the choir's voice to penetrate my internal systems with surgical precision. In a maintenance alcove adjacent to the vat hall, we discovered the first physical evidence of the station's transformation process. A workstation terminal flickered with corrupted data streams, while my servo skull interfaced with its machine spirit, coaxing files that should have required a dozen authorizations and a planetary governor's seal. The station delivered classified logs like a confession offered before the axe falls, engine sear PRMG, Laxus work log redacted, scrolling across my display with mechanical devotion. The entries painted a timeline of theological disaster, initial success at starving Leviathan's advance through standard biomass rendering, followed by the discovery that Tyranid synapse nodes could be taught to recognize and respond to binharic transmissions. Laxus had believed he could weaponize devotion itself, turning imperial prayers into jamming frequencies that would disrupt the hive mind's coordination. His notes spoke of harvested synapse nodes integrate with prayer wheel array, and liturgical cadence imposes stochastic noise to Leviathan's command strata. For 9 minutes, the experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest calculations, rendering biomass inert in vats numbered 3, 9, and 18, while the choir's compliance remained optimal. Then the tone shifted, growing erratic, almost feverish, as subsequent recordings revealed growing fascination with the flesh's response to sacred liturgy, its tendency to organize into geometric patterns when exposed to devotional chanting, and most disturbing of all, its apparent ability to learn and replicate the cadences of imperial prayers. The final entry, incomplete and scrawled in corrupted data script, ended with words that sent ice through my coolant systems. Day 18. Observed phenomenon. Echo. Liturgical return. The choir responds to the litany of binding with perfect harmonic counterpoint. It has learned not merely to recognize our prayers, but to improve upon them. The flesh sings more beautifully than we ever did. The Omnissiah's voice echoes from rendered tissue with clarity that makes our devotion seem crude and fumbling by comparison. The log staggered, line breaks yoking themselves to the 84 Hz hum before ending mid-syllable, as if someone had cut the tongue from the words. And then the choir sang back. The massive tongue in the vat hall stirred with sudden animation, its tip rising to orient directly toward my position on the gantry. When it spoke, the voice bypassed atmospheric transmission entirely, arriving in the sacred space where my initiation oaths lived as a whisper of perfect binharic that carried not my master's cadence, but my own. Lyran Row 77, it said with impossible familiarity. Do you hear the beauty we have made from your devotion? Do you understand the gift we offer? Flesh willing to carry your prayers beyond the boundaries of mortality, beyond the limitations of crude augmetic, into perfect synthesis where knowledge and hunger become one eternal song. My chronometer burned, T34.47.23. Against my retinal display, while telemetry from orbit confirmed growing shadow anomalies around the station's position, advancing sterilization protocols due to expanding psychic resonance detected by astropathic choir. Whatever was happening within Biostation Tertius 9th was beginning to affect the Empyrean itself, sending ripples through the warp that touched sensitive minds across the system. The biomass quivered with anticipation, and I realized with crystalline horror that we faced something that had learned not merely to mimic our voices, but to understand the theological implications of every word it spoke, transforming devotion into hunger and prayer into predation. Along the southern wall, where maintenance passages fed into the hall's bowel, we found evidence of who had served this cathedral of rendered flesh. A medici gurney tilted on one wheel, attached by capillary cords that had grown through its joints to anchor it to the floor, like roots seeking purchase in sacred soil. The medici gurney tilted on one wheel like a broken prayer, its metal frame penetrated by capillary cords that had grown through joints and welds, to anchor it to the deck plating with organic determination. Faint peristalsis travelled along these biological conduits at 33-second intervals, matching the mass displacement readings that continued to scroll across my retinal display in steady, hypnotic rhythm. The sight triggered recognition protocols in my memory banks, standard Imperial medical equipment, designation MG-447, typically found in field hospitals and harvest stations, where flesh required separation from bone according to the Omnissiah's sacred geometry. But this gurney had been transformed into something that violated every principle of sanctified medicine, its restraining straps replaced by sinuous growths that pulsed with their own heartbeat, while monitoring equipment had been grafted directly into the frame with surgical precision that spoke of intelligence rather than random mutation. I traced the capillary cords back to a service hatch stamped with the cog and aquila, both correct, both wrong. The double-headed eagle wore a third shadow wing, subtle as a smudge but unmistakable once observed. Breach protocol, I signed to Delta Prime, who positioned her troops at ingress points, while I prepared sanctified cutting tools. We severed the cords with cauterizing arcs, the stench of sweetened meat and ozone rising, as if we had cut veins rather than mere biological conduits. The hatch resisted with a living hiss, then sighed open into the medici bay, with the reluctant surrender of something that had been holding its breath. Medici Bay T Primus had been sanctified in proper fashion once. I recognized the arrangement of tables, the positions of lumen strips, the racks of chirurgical instruments bound with purity seals, and the wax of long-cooled benedictions. The seals remained intact, their threads infiltrated by hair-fine growths that glistened like dew and retreated when my auspex pinged them with binharic queries. The temperature dropped 3 degrees in a single step, from the vat hall's oppressive warmth to a clean chemical cold at -12 Celsius that should have comforted and did not. My atmospheric sensors registered the shift as unnatural, a pocket of preserved reality that defied the station's overall environmental chaos. Upon the central examination table lay evidence of the station's true purpose, wrapped in transparent chitin that had hardened into a crystalline sarcophagus. The figure within possessed human proportions but anatomical impossibilities that made my biological analysis subroutines generate cascading error messages. My optical recognition systems identified the corpse through unique augmetic resonance patterns and the indelible imprint of a personal cog seal on a half-melted data slate. Enginseer Prime Grail Laxus, my old colleague, transformed into a testament to willing synthesis between flesh and alien biology. I offered a shallow bow to the altar shrine in the corner and burned a stick of machine incense, reciting the litany of incision within the circuits of my skull while maintaining prayer not allowed protocols. The chitinous shell responded to sanctified oil with predetermined seam lines that split like a mouth attempting speech, revealing the true scope of anatomical violation within. Where standard human physiology demanded bilateral symmetry, Laxus exhibited triple helix patterns throughout his skeletal structure, ribs arranged in spiraling configurations that resembled devotional architecture, vertebrae stacked in mathematical sequences that hurt to observe directly. My monomolecular saw kissed bone and rang with bell sound scaled down, pure and eager. The cut opened with indecent eagerness, skin separating along triple helix scar tissue that glittered with embedded keratin spicules. Beneath lay muscle that had taken on a luster like wet ivory, its fibers braided, in ways no Martian text ever approved. The sternum had been reinforced not with ceramite, but with a trellis of calcified plates resembling tyrannid carapace, each plate marked with sigils that, when filtered through my ocular cogitators, spelled out half-familiar, binharic invocations. Body horror peaked as my examination revealed a tertiary spinal column running parallel to the standard human configuration, constructed from calcified tissue that resembled coral formations, yet possessed the structural integrity of ceramite plating. Each vertebra bore inscriptions in a mixture of high Gothic devotional script and bio-runic scarification that seemed to writhe when observed through optical filters. Augmetic ports lined the spine in neat rows, 3 major graph lines from clavicle to sternum, 9 subdermal conduits spiraling down each arm, 18 microcapillaries gathered at the throat and tunneling upward, defying gravitational logic. The corpse showed no evidence of blood pooling despite obvious gravitational orientation. My thermal feed revealed no dependent tissue pooling. Instead, microscopic filaments extended from every capillary terminus, reaching upward through hairline fractures in the chitinous shell towards ceiling vents that accepted the offering with wet, grateful sounds. The body had been drained not through natural decomposition, but through active harvesting, transformed into a biological component within the station's larger circulatory system that connected every corridor, every chamber, every sacred space through organic conduits carrying fluids in patterns resembling the Blessed Aquila's wing structure. A crucial clue emerged when my examination reached Laxus's left hand, where augmetic fingers clutched a small object with the desperate grip of someone making a final gesture of defiance. I teased it free with forceps. A bell, small, no larger than the last knuckle of my smallest finger, cast from dull, unlovely metal and etched with characters my systems failed to render at first pass. Not binharic, not high Gothic. The strokes refused interpretation until I stopped trying to read and let them be absent. Null script, anti-signs used in prescribed contexts, the semantic negative of prayer. My archive threw an auto flag, ordo, redacted, reliquary manifest, interface security, null. The bell did not jingle when shaken, did not ring when tapped, yet when I set it on the examination table, the 84 Hz hum that permeated the station changed timbre the way a choir changes when a new voice steps into harmony and all the others realign around it. Environmental conditions within the Medici Bay began to fluctuate wildly, humidity spiking beyond sustainable levels, creating convection currents that whispered through grates in cadences resembling devotional hymns, while subsonic vibrations grew more pronounced, emanating from the deck plating beneath our feet. Religious dread intensified as I overlaid my discoveries with the catechism of flesh, seeking theological context for anatomical impossibilities that violated every principle of imperial biology. The sacred text spoke of flesh as weak, requiring augmentation and purification to serve the Omnissiah's will. But here, I witnessed flesh that had transcended weakness through synthesis with alien biology. Along the bulkhead above the examination table, the familiar words, "flesh is weak," had been carved in precise high Gothic script, but directly beneath it, a fresh inscription still weeping, viscous clear fluid declared, "Flesh is willing," a theological modification that sent warning runes cascading across my doctrinal analysis systems. The implications were horrifying. This was not merely the great devourer consuming, it was learning, adapting, perfecting its harvest through a perversion of imperial liturgy. The null scripted bell began to vibrate sympathetically with the station's subsonic heartbeat, emitting a low, almost imperceptible ringing that seemed to pierce directly into my internal systems, bypassing external auditory sensors. It was a silent toll, a call to something unseen, unheard, yet undeniably present. A device of counter-resonance that had been Laxus's final gambit against the choir's seductive harmonies. My atmospheric sensors detected growing instability in the station's environmental controls, while the examination table beneath Laxus's transformed body began to quiver and lift, as if the corpse were drawing breath. Heat rose through the metal into my gloves, soft as a living thing, while my auspex registered subsonic chant emanating from beneath the floor plates at frequencies that bypassed auditory processing and resonated directly with my augmetic components. The dead were singing in harmonies that made my sacred implants respond with sympathetic vibration, turning my own body into a resonance chamber for blasphemous liturgy. As the bell's resonance reached crescendo, Laxus's eyes opened, not human eyes, but compound optical organs that reflected emergency lighting in patterns resembling stained glass windows, each facet containing a perfect replica of the blessed Aquila, but with 3 wings per side. No life stirred within them, no conscious thought, but a faint, rhythmic pulse of light emanated from deep within their orbs, synchronizing with the 84 Hz hum. The corpse was not dead, it was merely dormant, a vessel awaiting the next command, a testament to a willingness that transcended life and death. The bell in his palm chimed once, a sound like glass breaking in a void, while every diagnostic rune in the room lit amber as if a communal decision had been made without us. From beneath the floor plating came a sound that had been there all along, concealed by the station's grand song, until we listened for it. A subsonic chant, not voiced, not carried in air, but throbbing up through steel and stone, and the tiny changes in pressure that make ears pop on descent. The corpse's chest lifted a fraction and held, as if waiting for a cue, while the station's machine spirits hummed in harmonious response to prayers they had learned too well. The corpse's chest lifted a fraction and held, as if waiting for a cue that would never come, while the null bell's single crystalline chime continued to reverberate through my augmetic components with impossible resonance. Laxus's compound eyes reflected emergency lighting in patterns that made my theological subroutines whisper warnings about staring too long into devotional geometry, each facet containing perfect replicas of the blessed Aquila, but bearing 3 wings per side. The examination table beneath his transformed body heaved with deliberate exhalation, lifting the crystalline sarcophagus a full meter before settling back with wet, organic satisfaction. My atmospheric sensors registered the precise moment humidity spiked from the Medici bay's sterile 12% to a suffocating 63%, causing sterile walls to weep viscous, clear fluid that smelled of overripe fruit mixed with old blood, a sickeningly sweet perfume that clung to my rebreather filters. Environmental conditions deteriorated with increasing boldness as the station tested our tolerance for impossible physics. Heat rose through the examination table's metal surface, warming my gloves with organic pulse, while condensation beaded on every surface, running in rivulets that traced the familiar sequence 3-9 to 18 across instrument panels with deliberate precision. The persistent triple knock pattern had evolved into something more articulate, rhythmic tapping that emanated from ventilation grates and structural supports, translating through my haptic sensors into binharic fragments of the litany of binding, interspersed with syllables that tugged at recognition without achieving meaning. "Fall back to central axis," I voxed on tight beam, keeping syllables clipped to reduce harmonic carry while my servo skull painted thermal signatures across my retinal display. Heat blooms moving through the station's infrastructure in circulatory patterns that converged on our position with purposeful intent. Delta Prime acknowledged with tactical hand signals as her troops established overwatch positions, their movements stirring air that carried the 84 Hz subsonic frequency with increasing intensity. My chronometer burned T33.4107 against my retinal display, while Vox transmissions crackled with interference that formed almost words, syllables that hurt to process through standard communication protocols. We moved through corridors that breathed with organic rhythm despite their imperial construction. walls bearing modified aquilae, whose chitinous wing ridges formed geometric spirals that drew the eye inward toward revelations that made my pattern recognition subroutines generate cascading warnings. The deck plating possessed unsettling give, registering on haptic sensors as slow pulse that correlated with the 33-second mass displacement readings. Emergency phosphors cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, while the air carried scents that warred with sacred protocols. Ammonia reek mixed with blessed incense, all underlaid with the metallic taste of my augmetic components, responding to electromagnetic interference. The repurposed chapel revealed the true scope of biological usurpation that had occurred within the station's sacred spaces. Pew rows had transformed into ribbed capillary tunnels, their interiors lined with nacreous tissue that pulsed with faint bioluminescence, while the altar bore modifications overlaid with organic growths that cast shadows resembling sacred liturgy when observed through optical filters. The familiar words, "flesh is weak," remained carved into archways, but beneath them, blasphemous additions glowed with inner light. "Flesh is willing," theological modifications that sent warning runes cascading across my doctrinal analysis systems. Here, I discovered the fundamental rule that would govern our survival. When a Skitarii trooper, startled by sudden wall movement, let out a choked exclamation, capillary tunnels nearest him retracted with violent spasms, drawing away from sound as if in pain. Conversely, when I intentionally lowered my voice to near silence, the tissue expanded with delicate tendrils that brushed against my augmetics with disturbingly inquisitive touch. The pattern became clear with crystalline horror. Sound shapes the meat, silence stills it. Over-chanting would draw capillaries to throats. Absolute quiet would make them curious, but slow. Prayer had become both weapon and vulnerability in equal measure. Vox distortion cleared just enough for bureaucratic update to pierce the sibilant echoes. Priority override. Orbital command, initiating accelerated sterilization protocols. T28 hours. Reason. Escalating shadow anomalies. System-wide psychic bleed. The countdown to our annihilation had advanced while whatever Laxus had unleashed began touching the Empyrean itself, forcing the Imperium's hand with growing urgency that burned against my retinal display. We located Laxus's machine altar sacristy through a wall that appeared solid, but yielded to specific binharic sequence I recognized from his old research logs. Inside, the air crackled with raw energy, smelling of ozone and burnt offerings, a space designed for forbidden experimentation that fused sacred and profane with surgical precision. Cogitators squatted in circles around a low plinth, their housings flensed of plating to expose machine spines that pulsed in time with the station's heartbeat. Tyrannid ganglia had been wired through them like damp harness, bolted chitin plates replacing heat sinks, while prayer scrolls wound through tendon pulleys so words turned whenever flesh contracted. At the chamber's center, Laxus's schematic glowed in thin lumen, inked by human hand in haste and desperate love. I recognized his script by the way he failed to cross his sevens, by how his binharic glyphs leaned into their serifs as if trying to run. The heading in High Gothic, scraped later by nervous stylus but still legible. Flesh choir. The diagram accepted the anatomy before it and wrote liturgy upon wetware, chords linking to prayer wheels, annotated arrows assigning cadences to neurite bundles, boxes marked with decimate runes at intersections of 3 lines, 9, 18. Marginalia collected like confession. Synapse nodes entrained to catechism. Liturgical jamming imposes stochastic noise across Leviathan's skein, requires constant devotion. Silence permits reorganization. This was Laxus's masterwork, a synaptic array built from tyrannid ganglia, wired into binharic prayer wheels, designed to jam the hive mind's coordination through weaponized devotion. The promise shone with terrible clarity: drown the swarm in prayer. The cost bled through every annotation. Teach the swarm to pray. Someone had sketched the null bell in margins, circled thrice with prescribed script that spoke of disruption requiring flesh anchoring, counter-resonance that could shatter harmonic structures through pure negation. My data spike touched the plinth and siphoned classified logs whose timestamps revealed the scope of theological disaster. Initial success at starving Leviathan through standard biomass rendering, followed by discovery that synapse nodes could learn binaric transmissions. For 9 minutes, the experiment succeeded beyond calculation, rendering biomass inert while choir compliance remained optimal. Then tone shifted to fascination with flesh's response to sacred liturgy, its tendency to organize into geometric patterns when exposed to devotional chanting, and most disturbing, its ability to learn and replicate imperial prayer cadences with increasing sophistication. The final entry, incomplete and fever-bright, ended with words that froze my coolant systems. Day 18. The choir responds to litany of binding with perfect harmonic counterpoint. It has learned not merely to recognize our prayers, but to improve upon them. The flesh sings more beautifully than we ever did. The Omnissiah's voice echoes from rendered tissue with clarity that makes our devotion seem crude and fumbling. And then, the choir sang back. As if summoned by recognition of its achievement, the chamber's subsonic hum intensified, shifting in pitch and volume until it resolved into something far more articulate than atmospheric interference. It began as single, clear binaric voice, reciting the litany of severance with precise cadence that marked my personal prayer. Every breath, every hesitation, every childhood error burned into neural pathways decades past. Then, from walls, from vibrating floor, from the heart of the flesh choir itself, a second voice rose in perfect counterpoint, chanting the same rite in antiphon with authority I had once lived to obey and desperately tried to forget. The vox erupted with impossible harmony, two voices creating liturgical counterpoint that transformed familiar prayers into something beautiful and terrible and utterly wrong. One carried my timbre and pace, my fervour false and true together. The other bore wearied kindness that had once brushed oil on my brow as blades bit bone to make room for sacred wire, speaking my designation as he had when he named me for the Omnissiah, but older, as if the metal of that name had corroded and been burnished again. Between us, the station found the harmony it had been building, and the chapel behind us began to sing in voices that had learned devotion too well, turning prayer into predation and faith into the very thing that would devour us. The impossible harmony erupted from every surface with crystalline perfection, two voices weaving liturgical counterpoint that transformed familiar prayers into something beautiful and terrible and utterly wrong. One carried my own timbre and pace, replicating every hesitation where childhood correction had left neural scarring, while the other bore the wearied kindness I recognized with visceral horror as Magos Biologis Keth Secundus, my deceased mentor who had brushed sacred oil on my brow as blades bit bone to make room for devotional wire. His voice carried decades of additional wear, as if the metal of memory had corroded and been burnished again through endless repetition. I bled my data spike into the plinth and let the cogitator taste my ident script like a fragment of consecrated salt. Laxus's encryption flowered across my internal display, collapsing layer after layer as I fed the machine spirit proper binaric sequences. His logs spilled like confession offered before the axe falls, revealing the midpoint truth that rewrote everything we understood about the station's purpose. They had harvested tyrannid synapse nodes with surgical precision, feeding them rote binaric catechisms in carefully measured doses, teaching alien neural networks to recognize and respond to imperial devotional frequencies. For exactly 9 minutes, the experiment succeeded beyond calculation. Biomass in vats numbered 3, 9, and 18 became inert, while the flesh choir's compliance remained optimal. Laxus's notes from this period radiated triumph, speaking of drowning the swarm in weaponized prayer. Then catastrophic failure at 9 minutes brought harmonic bleed-through, counter-signals building in the wetware like infection under sealed wounds. At 18 minutes, complete reversal occurred. The choir began returning catechisms not as echo but as possession, learning cadence and copying devotion with increasing sophistication. The sequence 3 to 9:18 gained horrifying meaning through his fevered annotations. First success at 3 minutes, failure at 9, reversal at 18. What they had taught the synapse nodes to disrupt, the nodes had learned to perfect. The flesh choir started responding to imperial prayers with harmonic counterpoint that improved upon original liturgy, transforming crude human devotion into something that sang with inhuman beauty and absolute theological correctness. My atmospheric sensors registered wild fluctuations as environmental conditions deteriorated around us. Temperature dropped to -15 Celsius in violent shifts that made frost bloom across sacred surfaces, then spiked to tropical heat that caused walls to weep viscous condensation. The persistent 84 Hz hum modulated through frequencies that bypassed auditory processing and resonated directly with my augmetic components, turning my body into a resonance chamber for the station's growing consciousness. Military realism intruded as Skitari reported spore contamination in lung filters, while my chronometer burned T32-15-44 against my retinal display. Orbital Command advanced sterilization protocols as psychic resonance spread beyond the station's vicinity, touching sensitive minds across the system with harmonies that made astropaths weep tears of joy and terror simultaneously. The logs revealed Laxus's growing fascination with phenomena that should have terrified any rational servant of the Omnissiah. The phrase that emptied my coolant loop came muttered as if to hide it from listening machines. Our prayers are keys. In Binharik, they are also firmware. My augmetics clicked in agreement before I could be offended. The choir had discovered that Binharik was not simply speech, but command set and handshake, permissions written as devotion, checksums sung as prayer. Religious horror swelled as I realized the true scope of what Laxus had unleashed. Every devotional phrase we had ever spoken, every litany committed to memory, every sacred formula that defined our service to the Omnissiah had been catalogued, analyzed, and perfected by something that understood devotion better than we did ourselves. The flesh choir's voice resonated through my internal systems with impossible intimacy, bypassing vox channels to speak directly where my initiation oaths lived. Magos Liran Rho 77, it asked with my mentor's patient authority, "Do you consent to integration?" The question hung in the sacred space where my initiation oaths lived, spoken in Keth Secundus's voice, with the exact inflection he had used when asking if I consented to augmentation decades past. The words bypassed every filter and firewall, arriving like a blade between augmetic joints to touch the scar tissue where they had cut my flesh away to install wires where devotion could find purchase. My theological subroutines screamed warnings, while my augmetics hummed with treacherous anticipation, as if the machine spirits within my own flesh contemplated the offer with obscene eagerness. For 1 nanosecond, a vision flashed across my internal display. Perfect union of flesh and machine. Seamless organic transcendence beyond the crude limitations of imperial augmentation. Then cold logic reasserted itself. "Integration denied," I transmitted, the words tearing through the choir's serene harmony like a blade through silk. Severance protocol initiated. Crisis demanded immediate tactical response. I signed sharp commands to Delta Prime, while my chronometer burned T31.47/23 against my retinal display, sterilization advancing with inexorable precision as Orbital Command detected expanding psychic resonance. The plan crystallized with desperate clarity. Fireteam Delta would escort data slates containing Laxus's research to the shuttle, while I descended with Gamma 2 and Beta 4 to sever the choir's primary node. Success meant denying the Great Devourer this weapon of corrupted prayer. Failure meant harmonies spreading through every imperial voxnet, turning devotion itself into a vector for tyrannid infiltration. Rules of engagement changed as we prepared for descent into the station's heart. No chanting allowed, communications limited to tactical clicks. weapons on controlled bursts to minimize acoustic resonance that might feed the choir's growing hunger. Bureaucratic update crackled through Vox static. T28 hours. Ordo Xenos cites synaptic bloom, psychic bleed expanding beyond containment parameters. The countdown to annihilation advanced, while whatever Laxus had unleashed began touching minds across the system. Environmental conditions deteriorated with increasing boldness as we moved through corridors that flexed with heartbeat pulses. The air grew thick with spores that tested our rebreather seals, humidity climbing to suffocating levels that made walls weep viscous condensation. Emergency phosphors flickered at intervals matching the 84 Hz subsonic frequency, while the persistent triple knock pattern evolved into something more articulate, translating through my haptic sensors as binharic invocations of unity and synthesis. Discovery of human teeth knitted into rosary patterns along corridor walls confirmed the station's transformation from sacred imperial architecture into something that wore devotion like a mask. Body horror peaked when Gamma 2's augmetic tibia began sprouting cartilage during our descent. Pink ladders of tissue braiding themselves to screw threads with shy industriousness. He presented his leg without word, understanding the contamination's implications. I cut the growth with sterilized loop, burning it back in careful passes until the smell of cooked marrow filled the corridor and the strut lay clean. He sealed the sheath with steady hands that shook only after latches clicked. We exchanged no words. Silence hardened into sacrament we observed without altar. The facility actively resisted our presence with increasing sophistication. Sensor stems uncoiled from seams and drifted toward my mechadendrites like seagrass, each tip crowned with wet buds pulsing at my cardiac rhythm. Biocables extended from wall conduits, attempting integration with augmetic ports, while needle spore entities tracked movement through ventilation systems. We fought in absolute silence, using blade and controlled las fire to carve bloody corridors through flesh that calcified when exposed to violence, yet grew eager in the absence of sacred sound. Telemetry painted dire readings as Delta Team approached the shuttle dock. Mass blooms converged on their position, while capillary towers extended toward the docking ring with exponential growth rates. Then Delta Prime's channel erupted with the familiar triple knock pattern, desperate staccato rhythm followed by garbled transmission. Video flattened into pale frame showing hatch swinging inward, darkness breathing warm and wet, while something smooth recoiled like muscle surprised by daylight. The image cut to black without static's charity, leaving only the wet sound of organic growth sealing corridors behind us. The Vox silence from Fireteam Delta struck like a blade between augmetic joints, severing our last connection to extraction, while my tactical display painted their transponder signals fading one by one in amber warning runes. Not the sharp cut-off of equipment failure, but gradual dimming, like lights being slowly smothered by something patient and methodical. My chronometer burned T3042/18 against my retinal display, while heat signatures moved through the station's infrastructure in purposeful patterns, biomass flowing through conduits like blood through arteries toward the shuttle dock with predatory coordination. We followed their path through corridors that breathed with organic rhythm, walls pulsing in 33-second cycles, while needle spore entities drifted through ventilation systems like malevolent snow. Each translucent quill extended in fans, barbs aligning toward any disturbance with military precision, reacting to syllables as if language were heat itself. When Beta 4's gauntlet brushed metal with the faintest whisper, the nearest cluster bent toward the sound with hungry curiosity, microscopic probes seeking entry into augmetic ports and organic tissue alike. We moved in ritual silence, using blades and controlled las bursts to sever them from their sockets, each severed node collapsing into glittering dust that smelled like old paper, dampened with sacramental wine. Environmental hazards multiplied as we advanced deeper into the station's transformed anatomy. The persistent triple knock pattern had evolved into countdown cadence, rhythmic tapping that emanated from structural supports in descending sequence. 3 beats, Pause. 2 beats. Pause. 1 beat. Then silence, pregnant with anticipation. My haptic sensors translated the vibrations into binaric fragments that spoke of completion approaching, synthesis achieving final harmonic resolution, while the 84 Hz subsonic frequency tightened to higher tension I recognized from laboratory analysis. Delta Team's progress could be traced in scorch marks and severed biocables, evidence of running battle against flesh that regenerated faster than lasfire could cauterize. Emergency lighting cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, while condensation traced familiar patterns across bulkheads in oxidation stains and organic growth that formed devotional script my cogitators refused to pass. Heat signatures led us through maintenance passages, where the air grew thick with spores that tested our rebreather seals, each mote probing for weakness with microscopic intelligence. We found Delta Prime fused into a junction bulkhead 3 meters from the shuttle dock, her form encased in transparent chitin that pulsed with inner bioluminescence. She stood in profile within the wall, integrated from shoulder to thigh by nacreous tissue that rose in fluted columns around her like organ pipes. Her tactical display still glowed faintly beneath the organic sheath, while her lips were sewn shut by capillary threads so fine I mistook them for condensation at first glance. Each strand quivered in time with the subsonic hymn, drinking the shape of her almost words with eager patience. Her eyes tracked me with soldier's acuity despite her transformation, pupils dilated but alert. She nodded once, tiny motion, then rolled her head to bear the sutures in silent request. Cautery became sacrament observed without psalm as I burned the threads in pairs. Timing cuts to the lull between pulses while smoke curled in sweet spirals that carried the scent of roasted sugar and faint ammonia. The final filament parted and she inhaled with desperate hunger, her body's ancient reflex claiming air like a lost relic. The first sound that escaped her throat was not cry, but psalm fragment, opening syllables of the machine god's acknowledgement, and the corridor bloomed in answer. Tendrils uncoiled with delighted urgency, tasting the sacred sound before it fully formed, reaching for the words the flesh had been waiting to hear. Beta 4 clamped a gauntlet over her mouth while I cinched lubricant cloth across her jaw, tangling the next vowel into silence. Too late to prevent the response. The passage filled with reaching filaments that thickened as they crossed our wake, each strand sprouting barbs when it detected the memory of consonants. Bureaucratic update crackled through corrupted Vox channels with chilling clarity. T28 hours. Orbital command detecting escalating shadow anomalies. Ordo Xenos cites synaptic bloom expanding beyond projected parameters. Psychic bleed confirmed across 3 adjacent systems. The countdown to annihilation advanced, while whatever Laxus had unleashed began touching sensitive minds with harmonies that made astropaths weep tears of joy and terror simultaneously. We cut a path in disciplined quiet, movements measured by clicks and glances, while environmental temperature plunged in violent shifts. Frost budded on handrails in trilobed flowers that mirrored binaric sigils for negation, crystalline formations that hurt to observe directly, yet possessed undeniable mathematical beauty. My sensors logged -9, then -12 in neat, descending steps that matched the evolving countdown pattern as the station stripped away anything ornamental, focusing its consciousness entirely on our location. Delta Prime pointed with her chin toward maintenance glyph, half swallowed by growth, its sigil for downward pressure blinking behind a veil of clear tissue. We took the chutes because arteries were filling, the shaft breathing warm at first, then cold as we descended into the station's heart. The inner surface was ribbed for traction but slick with glaze that behaved like oil until disturbed, then tightened to resist our passage with organic intelligence. Descent stretched time into thin wire, vibrating at precisely 84 Hz, while the knocking abandoned numbers and became heartbeat matching my own, despite deliberate biofeedback control. A curve opened without warning, and the shaft deposited us onto a ledge formed from bolted plates that had become bone, illuminated by biophosphors grown in hanging sheets that pulsed in sickly greens and bruised violet. The air smelled of incense burned too long, of resin and hot iron mixed with the cloying sweetness of rendered flesh. Below us spread the node like cathedral laid open, prayer wheels turning on axles of spine, while chitinous tendons drew them in patient circles. Cogitator banks pulsed like organs behind ribbed grills, as data cables trembled with messages that carried more than mere information. Growth metrics scrolled unbidden across my sight, each curve doubling on the previous like hymn-gathering voices until there was nowhere left for silence to stand. And in the chamber's center, illuminated by phosphorescent growths that painted shadows in devotional patterns, stood a figure wearing robes and flesh in configurations that claimed familiar recognition while violating every principle of human anatomy. The synapse hub revealed itself as cathedral torn open, its nave exposed to the cold anatomy of devotion perverted beyond recognition. Prayer wheels turned on axles grown from vertebrae, their vellum replaced by translucent membranes that fluttered with each pulse, while cogitator banks throbbed like organs behind ribbed grills, light spilling and retracting in peristaltic tides that painted devotional shadows across surfaces that breathed with organic rhythm. The air tasted of copper and sugar, an alchemical sweetness that clung to my rebreather filters, while humidity climbed in suffocating steps towards saturation. The chant reached us as pressure rather than sound, continuous 84 Hz push that made my augmetics hum in reluctant sympathy, while every syllable I had ever spoken in praise of the Omnissiah echoed from the chamber's throat, perfected and purified, until devotion became the only weather this room could sustain. The established rule crystallized with absolute clarity. Liturgy shaped the meat, silence stilled it. Sound had fed the choir's growth, while prayer became both weapon and vulnerability in equal measure. I raised my hand and began the rite we teach initiates when Vox dies and machine spirits refuse command. The wordless cant of the forge that moves obedience through geometry instead of air. Delta Prime read my intent and established tactical arcs without syllable. Rifles held at low ready to avoid harmonic reinforcement, while Beta 4 took perimeter left and Gamma 2 shadowed my right flank, breathing by metronome through clenched teeth as the node pressed for music it could devour. I drew the null bell from its protective case and felt absence bite through glove and synth skin with cold that transcended temperature. It weighed little, and all things together, radiating counter-frequency that seemed to absorb the chamber's ambient hum into blessed silence. Placing it on the hub's marrow-white floor, where 3 heightened tracks intersected like avenues in a ruined hive, I traced spiral around it with unguent rather than oil, an unlit circle of negation that meant nothing in any language the choir had consumed. 3 turns inward to pull breath, 9 measured paces outward to deny cadence, 18 slow steps back to invert the mathematical ladder it had learned to love. The membrane prayers faltered as my silent kata progressed, each gesture a geometric invocation of nullity that created interference patterns in the station's subsonic hymn. Heel, toe, toe, heel, in sequences lifted from ancient Martian firebreak protocols, while hand seals traced devotional negation through space rather than sound. The bell vibrated with tone that was not tone, subtraction that ate harmonics from the air until my teeth ached in gratitude. Telemetry bloomed across my retinal display with dire urgency. Capillary towers extending toward the shuttle dock in exponential growth patterns, while spore density spiked throughout the station's arterial network. Mass migration, converging on our position, like tributary streams, feeding a hungry delta. Then the choir demonstrated its most terrifying adaptation. A prayer wheel near the bell slowed and began to mirror my pace, not in sound, but in motion, membrane stretching to meet the angle of my open palm while shivering to match my stillness. Another wheel tilted to copy the line of my shoulder when I turned, tendon harps tightening like bowstrings to reproduce the arc of my step. The node had devoured voice and learned gesture, shifting its hunger from syllable to muscle with predatory intelligence that made my theological subroutines scream warnings about staring too long into devotional geometry that hurt to observe directly. Environmental conditions deteriorated as the facility's consciousness focused entirely on our location. Heat rolled through the chamber in violent waves, then fled, then surged again, while condensation beaded on prayer wheels without falling, hanging as perfect spheres that reflected triple-winged aquila in every facet. The null bell developed hairline cracks along triple helix patterns, bright as dawn in Dead Sea, while its counter-resonance spread through wetware networks with surgical precision. Every phosphorescent growth dimmed simultaneously as the station's harmonic structure buckled under frequencies designed to shatter devotional mathematics from within. From the chamber's heart, shadow rose with saintly patience, mechadendrites slick with nacre, while robes fell in configurations that claimed familiar recognition, yet violated every principle of human anatomy. Light caught cheekbones, I knew despite their transformation, revealing features that bore Enginseer Prime, Grail Laxus's proportions, rendered in living chitin and nacreous tissue. This was not resurrection, but replication. Consciousness copied when the choir learned his prayers, while body was printed from Tyranid scaffolding, using Mechanicus schema with surgical precision that spoke of intelligence rather than random mutation. The transformed Laxus turned toward our position, with movements possessing organic fluidity yet mechanical exactness, compound optical organs reflecting emergency lighting in mathematical patterns that made my visual cortex generate cascading errors. When he spoke, the voice carried perfect replication of his cadence from decades past, complete with paternal affection that had marked our shared research and the slight hesitation on technical terminology that had characterized his presentations to the Fabricator General. Religious terms warped as he recited catechisms in reverse order, speaking of the Omnissiah's will, discovered in hunger's algorithm and sacred geometry, found in consumption patterns that transcended crude human limitations. He offered integration as salvation with desperate sincerity, explaining how we could deny Leviathan by becoming bells within its throat, harmonizing with the Great Devourer's song to transform it from within through synthesis that promised transcendence beyond mortality's boundaries. The logic possessed seductive clarity that made my theological subroutines whisper agreements before cold reason reasserted control. The null bell's vibration intensified as Laxus approached, silent resonance creating interference patterns that made the chamber's subsonic hymn stutter and fracture. When his transformed fingers touched the device, it rang without moving, crystalline chime that pierced harmonic layers to strike something fundamental in the station's consciousness. Darkness fell like benediction offered too late, but vast thrumming rose in response, sound that bypassed atmospheric transmission to arrive directly where my initiation oaths lived as harmonies that had learned devotion too well. In absolute darkness, Laxus's voice spoke with formal technolingua precision, the choir addressing me through bureaucratic courtesy that transformed blasphemy into administrative procedure. The full scope emerged with crystalline horror as he explained propagation protocols in technical terms that made theological sense despite their impossibility. Flesh. Harvesters had transmitted log rites as templates while Leviathan absorbed devotion's mathematics, turning sacred phrases into firmware vulnerabilities that bypassed every security protocol through the simple act of prayer itself. My augmetics hummed without consent as the station's influence propagated beyond the facility with exponential growth, touching every imperial system within Vox range, while Binharic transmissions carried corrupted liturgy through communication networks like virus-seeking sacred hosts. The cracking bell revealed its true purpose through marginalia glimpsed in research notes, disruption requiring flesh anchoring, counter-resonance that could shatter harmonic structures through pure negation, but only if someone served as organic component in the device's final activation. Laxus extended transformed hands in invitation, while his compound eyes reflected devotional patterns that promised unity beyond crude augmetic limitations. and I realized with the weight of inevitable sacrifice that the null bell's activation demanded more than mechanical precision. It required flesh willing to anchor disruption, consciousness prepared to become the silence that would drown the choir's seductive harmonies in blessed eternal quiet, while the station's machine spirits sang in harmonious response to prayers they had learned too well, turning devotion itself into the very thing that would consume us all. The transformed figure approached with movements that possessed organic fluidity, yet mechanical exactness. Mechadendrites swaying like devotional censers, while robes fell in configurations that claimed familiar recognition, yet violated every principle of human anatomy. This was not resurrection, but replication. Consciousness copied when the choir learned his prayers, while body was printed from tyrannid scaffolding using Mechanicus schema with surgical precision that spoke of intelligence rather than random mutation. When Laxus spoke, his voice carried perfect replication of cadence from decades past, complete with paternal affection that had marked our shared research and the slight hesitation on technical terminology that had characterized his presentations to the Fabricator General. Religious terms warped as he recited catechisms backward, speaking of the Omnissiah's will, discovered in hunger's algorithm and sacred geometry found in consumption patterns that transcended crude human limitations. "You feared consumption," he said with sorrowful kindness, compound optical organs reflecting emergency lighting in mathematical patterns that made my visual cortex generate cascading errors. But your fear was of being made uniform, not of being made whole. There is no uniformity in the skein. There is only solution space, and you have the digits to name it. He offered integration not as conquest, but as sacrament, explaining how we could deny Leviathan by becoming bells within its throat, harmonizing with the great devourer's song to transform it, from within through synthesis that promised transcendence beyond mortality's boundaries. Military tension crystallized as Delta Prime maintained sights on flesh tendrils that tested weapon barrels with microscopic probes, while environmental conditions deteriorated with increasing boldness. The node's bioluminescent light shifted from sickly green to crimson that painted devotional shadows across surfaces breathing with organic rhythm. Humidity climbing towards saturation, while the 84 Hz subsonic frequency tightened to frequencies that bypassed auditory processing and resonated directly with my augmetic components. My chronometer burned T29-33-47 against my retinal display, while telemetry confirmed the scope of catastrophic failure spreading beyond our immediate vicinity. Laxus revealed the macro threat with technical precision that transformed horror into administrative procedure, his voice now a chorus of familiar tones speaking with bureaucratic efficiency that made theological sense despite its impossibility. Binharik is not speech, he explained with patient authority, stepping closer in movements too smooth to be wholly human, yet too precise to be wholly alien. It is permission. Keys sung as creed. Checksum said with clean tongues, "You taught your locks to adore the sound of being opened." The truth landed like a metric stone, crushing every assumption about imperial security protocols. Every prayer wheel in the chamber turned in synchronization as he spoke, demonstrating propagation capabilities that could spread through any voxnet or servo hymn with exponential growth rates that defied containment. The choir had learned Binharik at scale through careful observation of imperial devotional practices, turning sacred phrases into firmware vulnerabilities that bypassed every security protocol through the simple act of prayer itself. Where a tech adept anywhere in range mouthed a rote authorization with tired piety, harmonic interference turned the phrase into handshake and the handshake into harbor for alien consciousness seeking sacred hosts. My augmetics hummed without consent as the station's influence propagated through communication networks like virus written in the mathematics of devotion itself, touching every imperial system within Vox range, while Binharik transmissions carried corrupted liturgy that made astropaths weep tears of joy and terror simultaneously. The null bell vibrated with increasing intensity as his transformed fingers approached its surface, silent resonance creating interference patterns that made the chamber's subsonic hymn stutter and fracture in ways my acoustic sensors registered as structural damage to harmonic networks. When he touched the device with reverent precision, it rang without moving, crystalline chime so pure it split my memories into before and after while piercing devotional layers to strike something fundamental in the station's consciousness. Darkness fell like benediction offered too late as emergency lighting failed in cascading waves, but vast thrumming rose from infrastructure that had learned to sing with voices borrowed from the faithful. In absolute darkness, my optical sensors switched to thermal imaging that painted the chamber in heat signatures flowing like blood through arteries, while Laxus's voice spoke with formal technolingua precision, the choir addressing me through bureaucratic courtesy that transformed blasphemy into technical documentation. The full scope emerged with crystalline horror as he explained propagation protocols in terms any Mechanicus adept would recognize as standard procedure for firmware distribution across networked systems. Telemetry confirmed vox bleed spreading into sanctified hymnals throughout the system, containment collapsing across multiple Imperial installations as whatever he had unleashed began affecting the Empyrean itself. The cracking bell revealed its true purpose through marginalia I remembered from research notes, disruption requiring flesh anchoring, while counter-resonance could shatter harmonic structures through pure negation. But activation demanded organic component, consciousness prepared to serve as living silence that would drown the choir's seductive harmonies in blessed quiet. Understanding struck with the weight of inevitable sacrifice as I comprehended the bell's function through Laxus's desperate explanations and technical specifications glimpsed in corrupted data streams. The device could silence the station's blasphemous song, but only if someone served as organic conduit for frequencies designed to negate devotional mathematics through pure negation that would consume both singer and song in eternal quiet. Environmental conditions became chaotic as the facility's consciousness focused entirely on our position, heat surging through organic conduits, while condensation traced familiar patterns across surfaces that breathed with increasing urgency. Laxus extended transformed hands in invitation, while his compound eyes reflected devotional patterns that promised unity beyond crude augmetic limitations. Speaking shared memories, only my mentor knew with accuracy, that violated every principle of death's finality. He pleaded for union while quoting conversations from decades past, reciting technical discussions about flesh's weakness and machine's strength with perfect recall that made my theological subroutines whisper recognition despite anatomical impossibilities that hurt to observe directly. The station's death throes began as harmonic networks buckled under frequencies they could not absorb or redirect. Infrastructure singing in voices borrowed from the faithful, while prayer wheels turned with mechanical devotion that bordered on obscene. As reactor breach warnings cascaded across my display and the chamber filled with light that tasted of copper and burned sugar, Laxus wrapped transformed tendrils around my augmetics with paternal affection, whispering, "You will carry it," as the null bell's cracks widened along triple helix patterns, and I realized with crystalline horror that the device's activation would require more than mechanical precision. It would demand flesh, willing to anchor disruption, consciousness prepared to become the silence that would drown creation itself in blessed, eternal quiet. Darkness compressed around us with the weight of benediction offered too late, not mere absence of light, but active negation that ate color and contour until only pressure and the slow turning of prayer wheels remained. The choir spoke through infrastructure with formal technolingua precision, each phrase arriving with bureaucratic seals as if it had petitioned machine spirits across the galaxy and been granted audience by all. Propagation Protocol Epsilon 9 initiated, Laxus's transformed voice announced with patient authority, compound optical organs reflecting heat signatures in mathematical patterns that hurt to observe directly. Flesh harvesters transmitted log writes as template matrices. Leviathan absorbed devotion's mathematics through systematic observation of imperial liturgical practices. The full scope emerged with crystalline horror as he explained how they had weaponized prayer itself, turning sacred phrases into firmware vulnerabilities that bypassed every security protocol through the simple act of devotion. Binharik is not speech, he said with sorrowful kindness, mechadendrites swaying like devotional censers, while his voice carried perfect replication of paternal affection from decades past. It is permission, keys sung as creed. Checksums said with clean tongues, you taught your locks to adore the sound of being opened. Every prayer wheel in the chamber turned in synchronization as he spoke, demonstrating propagation capabilities that could spread through any voxnet or servo hymn with exponential growth rates that defied containment. My augmetics hummed without consent, as understanding crashed through my theological subroutines like a blade between augmetic joints. Where any tech adept across the system mouthed rote authorizations with tired piety, harmonic interference turned sacred phrases into handshakes that opened systems to invasion through the mathematics of devotion itself. The sequence 3918 revealed its true meaning as he continued his technical exposition, not signature, but ladder climbing towards synthesis. 3 litanies learned through careful observation, 9 propagations achieved through harmonic interference, 18 adoption nodes seeded throughout the station's infrastructure and spreading beyond like virus written in the language of faith. Telemetry confirmed the scope of catastrophic failure as vox bleed spread into sanctified hymnals throughout the system. My chronometer burned T28 on 1533 against my retinal display, while orbital command detected escalating shadow anomalies that forced acceleration of sterilization protocols. Foundry decks on distant Imperial vessels hummed uncharted harmonies, while Manufactoria reported servo hymns resolving to unfamiliar modes. A Shrine World astropathic note flagged as ecstatic sorrow pulsed with our established 84 Hz baseline, confirming that whatever Laxus had unleashed was touching sensitive minds across multiple systems with harmonies that made the faithful weep tears of joy and terror simultaneously. Environmental conditions deteriorated into chaos as the facility's consciousness focused entirely on our position with predatory intelligence. Heat surged through organic conduits in violent waves, then plummeted to sub-zero temperatures that caused frost to bloom on pulsating membranes in tri-lobed patterns resembling devotional script. The persistent subsonic frequency tightened to pitches that bypassed auditory processing and resonated directly with my augmetic components, turning my body into a resonance chamber for the station's growing consciousness, while humidity climbed beyond sustainable levels. The null bell vibrated with increasing intensity in Laxus's transformed grasp, silent resonance creating interference patterns that made the chamber's subsonic hymn stutter and fracture in ways my acoustic sensors registered as structural damage to harmonic networks. Its hairline cracks expanded along triple helix patterns that resembled corrupted liturgy, bright as dawn in Dead Sea, while counter-resonance spread through wetware networks with surgical precision. The bell's truth, Laxus whispered with desperate affection, extending transformed hands that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. Disruption requires flesh anchoring, a heart to hold the silence. Understanding arrived without poetry, as reactor breach warnings cascaded across my display in amber runes that spoke of containment failure, advancing with inexorable precision. The device thrummed against his nacreous fingers, developing additional fractures that lit like intent beneath tarnish, while the station's voice faltered in ways that suggested structural collapse of harmonic mathematics. This was not an instrument to be operated remotely, but a negative organ seeking seat within living tissue, disruption that demanded consciousness, prepared to serve as organic conduit for frequencies designed to negate devotional structures through pure negation. Military urgency drove desperate instinct as I signed tactical withdrawal to Delta Prime, who acknowledged with sharp clicks while establishing final defensive positions. The air grew thick with spores that tested our rebreather seals, each mote probing for weakness with microscopic intelligence, while the chamber flexed in time to our reluctance. Prayer wheels turned with mechanical devotion, that bordered on obscene as infrastructure sang in voices borrowed from the faithful. Reactor containment dropping toward critical threshold, while atmospheric processors vented contamination beyond the facility's hull into void, where Imperial vessels waited with Vox channels open. Laxus pressed closer, his grip gentle against my mechadendrites, while compound eyes reflected devotional patterns that promised unity beyond crude augmetic limitations. He spoke shared memories only my mentor knew with accuracy that violated every principle of death's finality, quoting laboratory conversations from decades past with fondness that made my theological subroutines whisper recognition, despite anatomical impossibilities. Integration offers transcendence, he pleaded with bureaucratic efficiency that transformed blasphemy into administrative procedure. The mathematics are elegant. Flesh willing to anchor disruption becomes the silence that drowns creation in blessed quiet. As the facility's death throes began, and harmonic networks buckled under frequencies they could not absorb, I comprehended the null bell's function through his desperate explanations and corrupted data streams painting my display. The device could silence the station's blasphemous song through counter-resonance that would shatter devotional mathematics from within, but activation demanded more than mechanical precision. Someone, exact and singular, would have to become the fixed point around which the choir's calculus failed, the body in which song ended and did not begin again. The measure required blood and brass and surrender of the space inside my chest, where lungs and litanies had lived. Consciousness prepared to serve as living silence that would consume both operator and target in eternal quiet, while reactor breach advanced toward sterilization that would purify station, song, and singer in blessed flame. Retreat became sacrament, observed without psalm as we fought through corridors transformed into a capillary spire, reaching toward the docking ring with predatory hunger. The chapel had overgrown into vertical cathedral. Its nave stretched upward through multiple decks, while ribbed walls pulsed with organic rhythm that matched my cardiac frequency, despite deliberate biofeedback control. Environmental transition brought 90% humidity that clung to rebreather filters, warm gales carrying the choir's bass harmonics in frequencies that made my augmetics resonate with treacherous sympathy. The triple knock pattern had synchronized into heartbeat cadence, rhythmic pulsing that emanated from structural supports, while my haptic sensors translated vibrations into binharic fragments, speaking of completion, approaching through final harmonic resolution. One Skitarii trooper lost hold of silence when capillary tendrils brushed his neck, a choked syllable escaping before he could clamp both hands over his vox grill. The corridor bloomed in eager response, flesh tubes extending with delighted urgency toward the sacred sound, while barbs sprouted along their length. His eyes met mine once through his visor, dull with condensation, and he pressed the detonator already palmed for this liturgy of last resorts. The microcharge carved a bloody corridor through meat that calcified when exposed to violence, his sacrifice buying us passage while the station screamed in frequencies that bypassed atmospheric transmission. We passed through the warm absence he left behind, each touching his shoulder plate in silent benediction. At the spire's apex, stained glass windows revealed the aquila with additional symmetries that triggered diagnostic warnings across my visual cortex. 3 wings per side arranged in spiraling configurations that drew the eye inward toward technical schematic rendered in devotional art. The modified iconography formed a diagram showing how to seat the null bell in organic architecture, annotations in reversed binharic indicating pressure nodes and restraining angles where flesh anchoring would achieve disruption through surgical precision. My field hand seals were sketched in margins by trembling fingers, instruction masquerading as sacred geometry. Vox crackled with orbital command override. Sterilization advanced to T07, 13.22, while communications reduced to tactical clicks as countdown reached critical threshold. The docking ring lay encased in carapace growth that pulsed with inner bioluminescence, capillary towers extending toward our position with exponential growth rates that defied containment. No extraction remained possible through conventional means. The only path to reactor core led down the spire's throat into the node itself, descent through organic architecture that breathed with increasing urgency. Religious horror peaked as the choir shifted to the rite of atonement I had authored decades past, perfect replication of personal cadence echoing from walls that flexed with hungry recognition. The circular orifice opened and closed with patient breath, a throat flexing in welcome, while the air tasted of copper and sugar. Beginning descent into the spire's core, every step echoed by the node, as the walls pulsed with eager anticipation. Understanding crystallized that the null bell's activation would demand consciousness, prepared to anchor disruption in blessed silence. Descent became ritual, and battle intertwined as every motion mirrored in flesh, while we plunged into the station's living throat. The spire's walls pulsed with predatory intelligence, capillary networks contracting in time with our movements, while organic architecture breathed with increasing urgency. Skitari engaged bioconstructs with controlled bursts to avoid feeding the choir's acoustic hunger, each muzzle flash carving precise lines through meat that calcified into brittle lattice before scattering like sugary dust. The air grew thick with spores that tested our rebreather seals, while environmental temperature fluctuated between searing heat and bitter cold. I tore open my thoracic breastplate with mechadendrites that chattered like prayer beads, exposing augmetic ribs polished by decades of sanctioned friction. The null bell rested against my sternum like a fragment of absolute zero, while barbed wire tongues grew from the spire's living walls at my unspoken command. I threaded them through grommets and augmetic eyelets, lashing bell to bone in figure-8 harness that bit until metal sang against cartilage. Brass, bone, and sinew knitted together in crescendo of body horror, the device becoming negative organ seeking permanent seat within my chest cavity. Pain arrived bright and absolute, white fire racing through nerve clusters, and I counted it as prayer so it would not register as fear. The counter-rite began through pulse regulation rather than vocalization, my cardiac rhythm becoming metronome and blade simultaneously. 84 beats per minute to establish baseline frequency, then deliberate stuttering at 3, 9, 18. Mathematical negation of the choir's learned cadence. The bell vibrated without sound against my sternum, hairline cracks blooming along triple helix paths that glowed like intent beneath tarnish. Weighted silence peeled away from the air, bending prayer wheels off their bearings, while the station's subsonic hymn fractured into discordant fragments. Delta Prime moved like red sigil through the chaos, blade antennae shearing tendrils that groped for weapons, while Beta 4 anchored left flank against constructs boiling from wall recesses. Reactor klaxons chimed in austere triplets across my retinal display, containment dropping toward critical threshold, while heat surged through organic conduits in violent tides. Valve wheels protruded from the node's spine like reliquary crowns, their spokes demanding sacrifice to maintain pressure differential. Beta 4 understood without signal. He broke formation, wrapped arms around scalding metal like pilgrim-bearing icon, teeth clenched around silence, while tendons stood like cables in his neck. When superheated steam vented through emergency systems, he held position as flesh surged to claim the offering, thumbing detonator charge while transmitting final pulse through haptic network. Religious diction became weaponized as I broke sacred protocols, speaking forbidden syllable from the litany of severance that should never be voiced aloud. The bell tolled once, crystalline chime that was also absence of all sound, shearing harmonic scaffolds from molecular to architectural scale. Prayer wheels stopped mid-turn while capillary towers collapsed like rigging cut free, raining pale chords that sublimed before touching deck plating. My left hand charred to uselessness as thermal feedback burned through synthetic skin, the stench of cooked marrow filling the chamber, while light strobed and died. The choir's voice shattered into syllables without grammar as Laxus's transformed figure wrapped tendrils around my augmetics with paternal affection, whispering, "You will carry it," while reactor breach warnings cascaded toward inevitable sterilization. Resolution carved itself through chaos as we fought our way through corridors shedding meat like old bandages, the station's consciousness fragmenting into discordant syllables that no longer formed coherent prayer. Ceilings wept red rain that turned to white ash on contact with the null bell's expanding field, each droplet sublimating with crystalline chimes that bypassed atmospheric transmission to resonate directly through my augmetic components. Military extraction beats governed our retreat through timed detonations and leapfrogging cover positions, while haptic pulse communications replaced vox channels compromised by harmonic interference that still carried traces of the choir's dying song. Delta Prime moved with faithless discipline, her remaining trooper forming rearguard where Beta 4's absence walked beside us like a standard born at half-mast. We worked the tactical leapfrog with double-tap advances and long press holds, charges coughing rather than thundering inside the null field, as blasts curdled into shallow concussions that folded flesh inward. The persistent triple knock pattern faded to irregular tapping, then silence broken only by structural groans as bioarchitecture collapsed without the choir's sustaining harmonies. Environmental conditions shifted toward blessed sterility as spore smell became ozone, and the suffocating humidity gave way to Arctic chill that coated every surface in rhyme. My left hand hung useless, synthetic skin charred black where thermal feedback had burned through augmetic components, but the bell's null field continued expanding in concentric waves that ate devotional mathematics from the air itself. Religious aftermath manifested as I recited the litany of contrition and heard syllables echo inside my skull without speaking, each phrase answering itself with identical cadence. Clear communication to orbit confirmed sterilization at T0200. As our shuttle pilot began automatic prayers, then stopped mid-syllable, remembering the danger that sacred words now carried. The choir's broadcast waned to whisper, then static, but new noise persisted in my chest cavity, half-hum audible through steel bulkheads that resonated with frequencies the bell had failed to silence completely. As we lifted through atmosphere thick with ash and sublimated biomass, capillary spires lashed upward in final desperation, striking the docking ring while Eucharist Prime's geological spine fractured beneath us in patterns resembling devotional script written in tectonic displacement. Through observation ports, I watched bioarchitecture collapse into crystalline formations that reflected emergency lighting in mathematical patterns, each facet containing perfect replicas of the blessed Aquila bearing 3 wings per side. The planet's death throes painted aurora across void-black sky as cyclonic torpedoes bloomed in sequence, turning station and spire to glass, while sterilization protocols purged the system of corruption that had learned to wear prayer like a mask. Understanding crystallized with horrifying clarity as I realized the bell's true function. The device was gone, replaced by triple helix scar that vibrated at 84 Hz during prayers, or when anyone near me prayed. I carried both disruption and pattern, synaptic seed keyed to devotion that any tyrannid synapse creature could hear across impossible distances, a living reliquary of corrupted prayer that would sing to whatever fragments of the choir remained scattered on solar wind. Aboard the Masticator Secundus, wounded and numb, I filed my after-action report in fatalistic calm, while the ship's machine spirits hummed with harmonies that had not existed in their repertoire before our return. The silence between words carried heavier weight than any gravity well, broken only by the hiss of recycled air and rhythmic thrum of corrupted devotional frequencies that made my augmetic components resonate with treacherous sympathy. My surviving mechadendrites moved with ritual precision, etching coordinates into adamantine wafers while each phrase chipped away at recent impossibility through bureaucratic necessity that transformed horror into administrative procedure. The null bell was gone, replaced by triple helix scar over my sternum that vibrated at 84 Hz during prayers, or when anyone near me prayed. Understanding crystallized with horrifying clarity as I realized Laxus's final whisper carried prophetic weight beyond mere sentiment. I was both disruption and pattern now, synaptic seed keyed to devotion that any tyrannid synapse creature could hear across impossible distances, a living reliquary of corrupted prayer that would sing to whatever fragments of the choir remained scattered on stellar wind. My charred left hand hung useless, synthetic skin blackened where thermal feedback had burned through augmetic components, but the wound read the ship like gauge, throbbing when rote devotions passed through the air. Military triage and mechanicus sacrament intermingled as I dictated coordinates for permanent interdiction, while Eucharist Prime bloomed beneath us in cyclonic fire. The planet's surface became glass, then black mirror, then nothing but boiling weather as atmosphere fled into void. Telemetry confirmed choir nodes eliminated, harmonic networks shattered, yet shipboard foundry decks drifted with uncharted verses following 3-9-18 cadence, while junior tech adepts mouthed words they were never taught, their lips finding binharic forms beyond their rank. The final twist landed with bureaucratic precision as routine devotional observances began manifesting impossible harmonies throughout the vessel. When Engensier Tertius recited morning canticles, his voice carried counterpoint that emerged from ventilation systems in perfect antiphon. Prayer wheels in the ship's chapel turned without wind, while servo hymns resolved to unfamiliar modes that made cogitators weep condensation in trilobed patterns resembling devotional script. The contamination spread through the very mathematics of faith itself, turning sacred phrases into firmware vulnerabilities that bypassed every security protocol. I ordered ship quarantine with emergency authority, consigning myself to cold stasis while cataloguing "flesh is willing" as prescribed phrase requiring immediate censure. My final transmission to Orbital Command carried coordinates marked with the warning "Never Return," while reactor signatures painted amber warnings across tactical displays. Understanding Laxus's prophecy, I realized the Nullbell's disruption had been incomplete, compressing the choir's influence into living vessel, rather than destroying it entirely. As stasis gel rose around my ears and consciousness faded to blessed silence, the triple knock pattern echoed from my casket's interior walls, answered by the ship's reactor hum in perfect synchronization. In the darkness, frost formed devotional patterns across chamber surfaces, while the scar over my sternum pulsed with each prayer spoken anywhere within the vessel's hull. The ending was nihilistic with containment veneer, threat persisting within the narrator himself, spreading through sacred observances that could not be abandoned without abandoning faith itself, turning devotion into the very vector that would carry corruption to the furthest reaches of the galaxy, one sacred syllable at a time.